What if I told you that thousands of American B-17 bomber crews died not because of enemy fire, not because of mechanical failure, but because of a deliberate decision made by their own commanders? A decision so cold, so calculated, that it was classified for decades after the war ended. Today, we're going to uncover the dark secret that sent young American airmen to their deaths in the skies over Europe. This isn't the heroic story you learned in school. This is the brutal truth about why the B-17 Flying Fortress became a flying coffin for so many brave souls. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Just hearing that name conjures images of American industrial might, of brave young men flying through flak-filled skies to bomb Nazi Germany into submission. But there's another side to this story, a darker side that military historians have only recently begun to discuss openly. The B-17, for all its reputation as a fortress, had a fatal flaw that military leadership knew about from the very beginning. And rather than fix it, they made a conscious decision to send tens of thousands of young Americans into combat, knowing full well that many would die because of this design defect. The numbers are staggering. Of the 12,731 B-17s built during World War II, 4,754 were lost in combat. That's a loss rate of over 37%. The 8th Air Force alone lost over 26,000 airmen killed in action. Many of these deaths could have been prevented. The aircraft bristled with 13.50 caliber machine guns positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, theoretically creating an impenetrable defensive bubble. Stories circulated of B-17s returning with massive battle damage, yet still bringing their crews home. These stories were real, and they gave both crews and commanders confidence. But they masked a deeper, more sinister truth that wouldn't become apparent until thousands of young men had already paid the ultimate price. The deadly doctrine. American military planners were convinced that precision daylight bombing was the key to winning the war in Europe. Unlike the British, who had adopted nighttime area bombing after suffering devastating losses, the Americans believed they could succeed where the RAF had failed. American bombers would fly in tight defensive formations at high altitude during daylight hours, accurately hitting specific military targets. This doctrine wasn't just about military effectiveness. It was about American identity. Precision bombing was seen as more humane than carpet bombing entire cities. But there was a problem, a big problem, and military leadership knew about it from the very beginning. Here's the dark secret that was hidden from the American public for decades. The B-17's defensive armament was largely ineffective against German fighters, and military leadership knew it. Those 13.50 caliber machine guns that were supposed to create an impenetrable defensive barrier, they were positioned based on faulty assumptions about how air combat actually worked. The guns had limited fields of fire, blind spots that experienced German pilots quickly learned to exploit. And most critically, they were operated by crew members who had received minimal gunnery training. But the most damning aspect of this secret goes deeper than just inadequate defensive firepower. Internal military studies, conducted as early as 1942, showed that the B-17's defensive guns were effectively useless against determined fighter attacks. The studies revealed that bomber gunners, operating under the stress of combat at high altitude while wearing bulky flight gear and oxygen masks, had a hit probability of less than 2% against attacking fighters. Think about that for a moment. Less than 2%. For every 100 rounds fired by a B-17 gunner at an attacking German fighter, fewer than 2 would find their target. And of those hits, most would be ineffective against the armored German fighters that were specifically designed to attack bombers. The military brass knew this. They had the data, they had the studies. They knew that sending unescorted B-17s into German airspace was essentially a death sentence for the crews involved, but they continued to do it anyway. Why? The answer lies in a cold, calculated decision that prioritized strategic objectives over human lives. Military planners believed that even with horrific loss rates, the bombing campaign would achieve its strategic goals before the losses became politically unsustainable. They were willing to sacrifice thousands of young American lives in what amounted to a war of attrition. The standard tour of duty for bomber crews was 25 missions. But here's what they didn't tell those young men. Based on loss rates during 1943, the statistical probability of surviving 25 missions was less than 25%. 3 out of 4 crew members would be killed, wounded, or captured before completing their tour. These weren't hardened combat veterans. They were mostly young men. many still teenagers. Before each mission, crew members would look around and wonder who wouldn't be coming back. The constant stress of knowing that survival was largely a matter of luck took a tremendous toll. The physical conditions were hellish. At bombing altitude, temperatures could drop to 60 degrees below zero. The oxygen system was notoriously unreliable. Most terrifyingly, the B-17's fuel tanks were essentially flying bombs waiting to explode. A single tracer round could turn the entire aircraft into a fireball. As the casualties mounted, military leadership faced a dilemma. The bombing campaign was clearly not achieving its stated objectives quickly enough to justify the horrific loss rates. German industrial production was actually increasing despite the bombing. Fighter production was reaching new peaks. But rather than admit failure and change course, military leadership doubled down. They began a systematic campaign to hide the true extent of B-17 losses from both the American public and their own crews. Loss statistics were manipulated and classified. Instead of reporting actual combat losses, the military began using creative accounting methods that excluded aircraft lost to operational causes, a category that could include everything from mechanical failure to weather-related crashes. Suddenly, loss rates that had been approaching 10% per mission were officially reported as less than 5%. The military also began a propaganda campaign that emphasized the B-17's legendary toughness while downplaying its vulnerabilities. Stories of badly damaged aircraft making it home were widely publicized, while the far more common stories of aircraft that simply disappeared over Germany were suppressed. Here's perhaps the most infuriating aspect of this entire story. There was a solution to the B-17's vulnerability, and military leadership knew about it. The solution was fighter escort. Long-range fighter aircraft, like the P-51 Mustang, were being developed and produced as early as 1942. These aircraft had the range to escort bombers deep into German territory and the performance to engage German fighters on equal terms. When properly escorted, B-17 loss rates dropped dramatically, from nearly 10% per mission to less than 2%. But the fighter escort solution conflicted with the established doctrine of unescorted daylight bombing. Admitting that fighters were necessary would mean admitting that the entire strategic bombing theory was flawed. It would mean admitting that thousands of young men had died unnecessarily. So instead of immediately implementing fighter escort for all missions, military leadership continued to send unescorted bombers deep into Germany throughout 1943 and into 1944, early 1944. They had the means to dramatically reduce casualties, but they chose not to use them because it would require admitting that their fundamental strategy was wrong. The Schweinfurt raids of October 1943 perfectly illustrate this criminal negligence. Despite intelligence showing that these targets would be heavily defended, despite knowing that the distance involved precluded fighter escort, military planners sent 291 B-17s on what they knew was essentially a suicide mission. The results were predictable and devastating. 60 bombers were shot down, with another 138 damaged. Nearly 600 airmen were killed or captured in a single day. And for what? The ball-bearing factories that were the target of the raid were back in production within weeks. During the peak of unescorted bombing operations in 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 3.5% of its aircraft per mission. At a 3.5% loss rate per mission, a bomber crew had only a 35% chance of surviving the standard 25-mission tour. For deep penetration missions, raids on targets like Berlin or Schweinfurt, loss rates often exceeded 8% per mission. At that rate, only 1 out of 7 crews would complete their tour and return home. But the most damning statistic, when fighter escort became standard practice in 1944, overall B-17 loss rates dropped to less than 1% per mission. Crew survival probability increased to over 75%. The simple addition of fighter protection increased survival chances by more than 200%. This proves beyond doubt that the massive casualties of 1942 and 1943 were preventable. Military leadership had the means to save thousands of lives, but chose not to use them. Staff Sergeant Robert "Bobby" Martinez was the tail gunner on Lucky Lady, a B-17G that flew with the 390th Bomb Group. On November 26, 1943, during a mission to Bremen, his aircraft was attacked by a formation of German FW-190s. Martinez watched helplessly as the fighters exploited the exact blind spots that military studies had identified months earlier. We knew we were sitting ducks, Martinez later recalled. The Germans came at us from below and behind, right where our guns couldn't track them. I fired everything I had, but they were too fast, too smart. They'd studied our aircraft better than our own commanders had. Lucky Lady was hit by cannon fire that severed hydraulic lines and damaged 2 engines. As the aircraft began to lose altitude, Martinez made the agonizing decision to bail out over occupied territory. He spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. What haunts me isn't that we got shot down, Martinez said in a 1987 interview. What haunts me is knowing that if we'd had fighter escort, if our commanders had swallowed their pride and admitted their doctrine was wrong, my pilot and bombardier might still be alive today. Those boys died for nothing but stubbornness. When long-range fighter escorts finally became standard in early 1944, B-17 loss rates plummeted. The Flying Fortress finally lived up to its name, not because of its own defensive capabilities, but because it was protected by fighters that could engage the enemy on equal terms. The success of escorted missions proved that previous losses had been unnecessary. Every B-17 crew that died in 1942 and 1943 had been sacrificed on the altar of military pride and doctrinal rigidity. But rather than acknowledge this truth, military leadership began rewriting history, claiming the early campaigns had been necessary to learn lessons and develop tactics. The true extent of this dark secret didn't become public knowledge until decades after the war ended. Military records remained classified, and the few survivors who understood what had really happened were often reluctant to speak publicly about their experiences. It wasn't until military historians gained access to classified documents in the 1970s and 1980s that the full picture began to emerge. Internal memos, strategic assessments, and loss analysis reports painted a picture of military leadership that knew full well they were sending men to die unnecessarily, but continued to do so anyway. Even today, many accounts of the B-17 and the strategic bombing campaign continue to perpetuate the heroic narrative while glossing over the preventable nature of so many casualties. For the families of the men who died in those early bombing missions, this knowledge brings little comfort. Their loved ones are still gone, still heroes who served their country with courage and dedication. But they were also victims of a military establishment that prioritized doctrine over lives, strategy over survival. This story isn't just ancient history. It's a cautionary tale about the dangers of military groupthink, the importance of adapting tactics based on evidence rather than doctrine, and the ultimate cost of pride and institutional inflexibility. The B-17 crews who flew those early missions were genuinely heroic. They faced impossible odds with courage and determination. They believed they were fighting for freedom and democracy, and they were. But they were also betrayed by leaders who knew better but chose differently. We owe it to their memory to tell the complete story, not just the heroic parts, but the dark secrets as well. Only by understanding the full truth can we hope to prevent similar tragedies in the future. The dark secret behind B-17 casualties wasn't enemy superiority or technological limitations. It was the willful negligence of military leaders who had the means to save lives but chose not to use them. Thousands of young Americans died, not because their sacrifice was necessary for victory, but because their commanders were too proud to admit their strategy was flawed. The B-17 Flying Fortress became a symbol of American air power, but it should also serve as a reminder of what happens when doctrine becomes more important than the lives of the people who serve. These brave airmen deserved better from their leaders, and their memory deserves the complete truth. The next time you see a restored B-17 at an airshow or museum, remember, not just the courage of the men who flew them, but also the preventable tragedy of those who died because pride mattered more than people. That's the dark secret behind why so many B-17 pilots died. It's a secret that was hidden for decades, but it's a truth we can never afford to forget.